Hello, everyone. It's me, David Chen, and I'm here today on my channel with Mr. Dan Gvozden from the Amazing Spider Talk podcast. Dan, how's it going today?
I'm doing well. We're back for another Marvel show, David. I didn't think it would happen after our feelings about Falcon and the Winter Soldier, but here we are.
Just when I try to get out, they pull me back in. Really, is what's
Yeah.
going on. Welcome to my YouTube channel, and we are here to talk about Loki. And the way this is going to work is as follows. Every week after Loki airs, we are going to gather together on this YouTube channel, and we are going to discuss, and we're going to spoil everything through that week's episode. Dan Gvozden has the expertise of somebody who has been reading comics and is really into them his entire life, and I have no real expertise to speak of, but I have a YouTube channel that on occasion I talk about things on. So that is what the pitch of the show is. This week, we are going to be discussing Season 1, Episode 1 of Loki, entitled Glorious Purpose. Now, I do want to mention one other thing before we begin, which is last time we did a recap show on Falcon and Winter Soldier, a lot of people were asking, why isn't there a podcast version of this? Why can't I listen to an audio-only version of this? And so I am going to make an audio-only version of this, but it's going to be exclusive to my Patreon at patreon.com/DaveChen. So if you want the audio-only version, if you want the RSS link for my Patreon to put it into your podcast app, you got to be a patron. Any level is fine. Can be $1, can be more than $1, but patreon.com/DaveChen. So I want to give a shout out to patreon.com/DaveChen. I want to give a shout out to Dan Gvozden at the AmazingSpiderTalk.com. Check out his podcast as well. But yeah, this will be on YouTube for free. The audio version's on Patreon, and you can enjoy it in whatever format you want. But that is how we're going to do this. And, you know, I've never done anything like this before, so we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it goes well. Hopefully people enjoy this split. And if you already are one of the roughly 500 or so patrons over at patreon.com/DaveChen, hopefully you find this to be a worthwhile benefit. So
Pay David money so you don't have to see our faces.
yes, that is the goal. That is the goal.
Great.
Okay. So Loki, Season 1, Episode 1, Glorious Purpose, debuted in the last 24 hours. And this is the first of 6 episodes that's going to air on Disney+. It's going to come out on Wednesdays, unlike Fridays, which is what Falcon and Winter Soldier came out on. Now, Dan Gvozden, people who follow us on my YouTube channel or listen to any of my stuff know that my opinions on Falcon and Winter Soldier and WandaVision are mixed, right? WandaVision, I thought, started out great, became kind of normal Marvel fare, fairly conventional Marvel fare that ended up not being that interesting. And in fact, I thought the finale was pretty rough. Falcon and Winter Soldier, I just thought was overall pretty bad. In comes Loki. I have a lot of hopes. Got a lot of hopes for this one, Dan Gvozden. Hoping that this one is going to be interesting, going to be bold, going to be original, fresh storytelling. It's got Tom Hiddleston, super talented actor, playing a very not beloved, but certainly a compelling character from the MCU. So I was excited about this. I'm nervously optimistic about Loki, and I do want to disclose I've seen the first 2 episodes, and I gotta say, I'm really into the show so far. I loved pretty much both episodes. They're not like, there's some issues, we'll talk about them, but like overall, love the episodes. And so Dan Gvozden, that means I love 1/3 of the show already, which is incredible. I'm so excited. Your overall thoughts on the season premiere of Loki, Dan?
Yeah, well, I mean, just to establish, I have not seen the second episode. So I may take us down some roads, and Dave, you might know things. I'm sure you do know things that I don't know.
I will not spoil anything from the second episode. I will not talk about the second episode in any way. So
Great. Very, very excited about that.
But we will spoil everything through this week's episode. So yeah.
Yeah. I largely share your thoughts on the previous 2 Disney Plus shows, and I share your thoughts largely on Loki here. I think this was a really solid opening episode with some, fun things to do. But mainly this is kind of like a, setup episode. It's get the exposition out. And I think it largely is able to do so in a very not boring and exciting way, because it's got 2 great performances from Tom Hiddleston and Owen Wilson to support it. And the minute we get the two of those guys in a room together, you can just kind of see the magic of this premise working. And even though you're getting kind of mountains of exposition of things you've already seen and seeing this character experience, there's no getting away from the charm and that these two actors have. There's also some great music and really interesting set design, and that always makes it fun to kind of like see what's around the next corner. And like any good story, it establishes its stakes very clearly. You know what the rules are. It makes the rule giving exciting, kind of like Jurassic Park. I think about the animated DNA sequence. Yep. It's just like if you can find a way to make all of that fun, at least to me, it makes me very excited for what's to come, because once the rules are gone, that's supposed to be the boring part. And if I had this much fun with the boring part, I can't wait to see what they get to do when they actually get to bend and twist and break these rules that they've already established.
Great summary, Dan. And I think that Loki looks and feels different from most other Marvel things. I mean, what's really so interesting about Loki is that it pulls back the curtain on an entire other layer of reality that we didn't know about in any of the previous Marvel films, right? And that's what's so refreshing about it, is like, oh, this doesn't have anything to do with Thanos or stones or anything like that. Those things exist in this universe, right? But they're not what I would describe as this show's base reality. Like, there's something that actually is more powerful, more, compelling and interesting even than all that stuff that we've seen before. And it's really kind of bold in the way that it does it. So I am not, and the thing that also I think this show promises is it asks some really interesting questions, I think, about like who we are and the nature of time and space, and like how and if our actions, our histories, and our futures define us. And I think that's who knows if it's actually gonna deliver on that premise, but the fact that it's like kind of heading that way, I'm very, very intrigued. So, huge fan of episode 1. We'll talk about episode 2 next week, but I was a huge fan of that episode as well. But let's get into episode 1. All right.
Really quickly, I wanted to respond to something you said about like where this kind of exists within the Marvel universe. I was very dubious about like how Marvel would handle the cosmic stuff from the outset. I do a podcast all about Spider-Man, which is this very like grounded street level thing. And I think the early appeal of the Marvel Cinematic Universe was how grounded it felt. Like Iron Man felt like a real guy who built a metal suit in a cave. And, making the cosmic stuff, which I've always felt like, as much as I like it in the Marvel comics, the way it meshes with all of those things is a really tenuous balance. When you're dealing with like entities that are time itself and a guy that wears a metal suit, like those things can often clash with each other. But I think so far, and I think this is a great example of it, like this universe, like they have a really deft hand of making these things all feel cohesive in a way that they often don't. I mean, like how the like 9 realms of the Thor and Asgard mix with the Time Variance Authority.
Right.
If you can go cross-eyed thinking about it, but like they quickly make it feel linked so much that you can kind of ignore it and just go on the ride. And I think that's a real accomplishment, because this could feel tonally out of like left field. So
I mean, I agree with you that it does a really great job of weaving in MCU lore into the show. I do think it does feel a little bit out of left field, right? Like there's nothing that we have seen that even hints that anything like what we see in the show exists, right? And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying, like, to me, I'm like, wow, I'm trying to take in this new, really bizarre world that we're being introduced to. Anyway, let's get into the episode. So, the episode begins with the events of Avengers. The Avengers, I guess the Avengers Infinity War. Avengers Endgame.
Right.
Which, in Avengers Endgame, they go back to the events of the first Avengers, but we're seeing
Correct.
it from the perspective of the Avengers Endgame Avengers. Anyway, and the same footage is used, although you do get a little bit of an extra shot of Loki in the elevator there that you don't see in either of the previous Avengers films.
Do you think they shot this when they were doing that movie, or it's an insert?
Maybe, but it was like a close-up shot, right? So it could have been done anytime, I think.
Right.
It's a shortened cut from what we saw in Avengers Endgame, and then you see Loki vanishes with the Tesseract, which we saw in Avengers Endgame, and many people speculated, him vanishing will lead to the events of Loki, the miniseries, and that's what ends up happening. I do think you also hear Thor say, like, "Where's Loki? Where's Loki?" as the Marvel Studios thing comes up. I think that is net new. I don't think we ever heard that.
I don't think we've heard it either.
Yeah, so that was pretty cool. And then you get the Marvel logo, which it does something to me emotionally, Dan. Every time I hear it, big fan.
Even without that Avengers score pumping, I mean, this one felt really strange. You've got Natalie Holt, who is the composer. I thought it was like Mark Mothersbaugh at first. Like, it really had that kind of weird synthy thing going for it. I quite liked it. It threw me off.
I'm always a fan of when they, like, big studios like mess with their own branding and stuff. Also, Victor Leung in the chat is saying the Thor line was in Endgame. Well, first factual correction of the podcast right there.
There we go.
10 minutes in.
Mark it.
Yeah. We're not perfect. I'm not going to claim we're perfect at things. Sometimes we get things wrong, but thank you for people correcting us. We really appreciate it. Okay.
I had been claiming perfect, but I'll rescind that.
We go to the Gobi Desert, and the Time Variance Authority appears, and they're like, "Loki, we got to take you in." And then he gets slapped with this kind of collar that then allows him to get beaten over the face really in slow motion, right? And this is kind of cool. The way that the show introduces you to the concept of the Time Variance Authority in kind of these drips and drabs, and sometimes it's like, here's a bunch of information at once, here's a little bit of information. I kind of dug it. I was a fan of it overall. And this is kind of really the first taste we get of what the rest of the show is going to be about. Any thoughts on this opening scene?
Well, I think the really important thing for me in this scene is Loki and his kind of attitude. Like, we're seeing a, Loki we're kind of unfamiliar with, right? It's the Loki from the Avengers, the first Avengers era. And to see him kind of climb up on a rock and, use his height to, soapbox about his glorious purpose. This is a like showboating Loki who sees kind of power as something to kind of lord over people. And it's like very much a performance for him. Like, there's a real visual element to it, which I think kind of comes into play in the TVA. And we can talk about this greater when we discuss like the timekeepers and their presence in the show. Because it's interesting that he's so public about his power, whereas they're secreted away and we don't see them. And I think that's an interesting thing. Maybe you know about this, but at least to me, there's an interesting theme established about how people like showcase their power set up in this scene.
On that note, John Lee in the chat clarifies that the baton slows down the time and the collar is really to prevent his powers from working. So
correct.
I don't think anything I said contradicted that, but do want to clarify that that's the case. Okay. So he's taken to the TVA and he tries to escape and he can't, and they hand off the Tesseract as evidence. And then he's like stripped of his outfit and a bunch of weird stuff happens. Like, he's asked to sign off on a pile of documents that represents everything he's ever said. The whole thing reminded me a lot of Terry Gilliam's Brazil.
Me too.
In this kind of like extremely intricate, elaborate set that is also like super industrial and analog in some ways, right? A lot of paper usage. The technology is at once ultra futuristic and also feels like it comes from the 60s. You know what I mean? Like, and it's a whole aesthetic, a whole feel that I really dig. And so,
Very bureaucratic.
yes, absolutely correct. So,
There's also kind of this like friendly, like grabby robot, which reminded me a lot of this character from Fantastic Four named Herbie. I
mhm.
don't think it's meant to be that, but it's like so similar to it that it's hard not to make that connection when I look at it.
All right. So then he has to like take a number, and while he's in line, even though there's no one else in line in this huge room, the ultimate sign of bureaucracy, you being forced to take a number even though there's no one there. He watches a tutorial, like a tutorial basically on what's happening, right? Mrs. Minutes or Ms. Minutes, who explains the history of the TVA. It's very amusing tutorial, old school cartoon style, right?
Yeah,
Um,
correct. Yeah,
yeah,
like just like the Jurassic Park thing.
right, like Jurassic Park and Mr. DNA in Jurassic Park. Or this looks like something like Rocky and Bullwinkle style, like very old school, very familiar. And can you explain or recap what Ms. Minute says in this video, Dan?
Yeah, well, I mean, she kind of explains the kind of origins of the Marvel multiverse, which, for all the people talking about the multiverse in WandaVision, here we have like the first real
This is
official
the goods.
confirmation of
This
it.
this show delivers the goods when it comes to
Yeah,
the multiverse, right?
yeah, it does. There's the multiverse, and it seems to have spawned and gone quickly to chaos, creating something called the Multiversal Wars, which nearly ended the universe. And so, the TVA, the Time Variance Authority, was introduced to basically control and eliminate variances in the sacred timeline. And it's run by the timekeepers, who are kind of projecting or creating what is official in the sacred timeline. And there's these things called Nexus events, which are basically when a variant or someone who is altering that timeline in a way, whether significant or minuscule, that can create like a big fork in the timeline, just like we saw in Avengers Endgame with we had like Hulk getting taught about the fracturing of the timeline. Anyway, a Nexus event can occur, and this is what the Time Variance Authority is trying to prevent. And Loki is essentially one of those Nexus events that could disrupt the flow of time or the sacred timeline as we know it.
Pretty great summary, Dan. Nicely done.
Thanks.
Now the timekeepers, right? I think this is the first time we've been introduced to that concept here, and this is a concept from the comic books, correct?
Yeah, the TVA and the timekeepers are I would say like they're a moderately big thing in the comics. There's different eras where they'll show up more often than not. They actually haven't been used very much recently. But Mark Gruenwald, who wrote a lot of the Cap stories that inspired Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and elements of that story, he also was one of the people that invented and introduced this. So he's kind of got his fingers all throughout this. But yeah, they've been around for quite a while. I believe the early 70s. The timekeepers have a different name in the comics. They're called the Living Tribunal, and they are this like represented by this god who has three heads, or really it's like one head with three different sides to it, which you can see in the imagery all throughout this episode, the three-headed timekeepers. Although I hear they're presented, I think, as three separate beings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But we'll see ultimately if we do get to see them what it is. But the Living Tribunal is less interested in the comics in like a sacred timeline more than he is in keeping the multiverse in check or balanced. So if like one part of the multiverse is getting too evil, he'll go in there and destroy a few planets to balance things out. He's kind of always mucking around in like the fabric of reality to keep the multiverse in check.
I mean, I have questions about like
sure.
how does having multiverses, how do they war against each other? You know, like if you're in a separate timeline than someone else, how does it war against another timeline? Because it sounds like basically too many timelines split apart and they create these multiverses. People in the chat are saying this is a reference to Marvel's Crisis on Infinite Earths.
Yeah, there's a thing called Secret Wars. There's been multiple versions of the Secret Wars, including one from a few years ago from this writer, Jonathan Hickman, where basically the multiverse started to kind of like collapse in on itself. And so all these different universes started to collide. And basically one had to be the ultimate victor, right? So the Avengers created this team that was traveling to different universes and destroying them, so that like their universe, the Marvel 616 universe, would be the ultimate survivor.
Interesting. So universes can't coexist, unfortunately.
Well, they could, but it's too much to go into, but they were collapsing in on themselves. Like, for example, Miles Morales' universe, the ultimate universe, ended up getting destroyed during this event. And that's how Miles found his way into the same universe as Peter Parker in the comics. It's a whole complicated thing, but know that like there have been big events where the multiverse started to kind of collapse in on itself. Although the Living Tribunal wasn't really that present in that story, but he has been throughout it. And the TVA is this organization, very much like you see it in the show here. They have kind of had many different appearances throughout the comics. Sometimes they're shown to be like faceless bureaucrats, or sometimes they all look the same. The character Mobius, who we meet in this episode, sometimes he actually looks just like Mark Gruenwald, the writer. And sometimes all the different timekeepers will look exactly like him. Sometimes they look like soldiers, like you see in this episode. But basically, they are like a Men in Black like organization that keeps track of the timeline
and preserves the one and only sacred timeline, right? Like,
yeah, within each universe. Each universe has its own TVA. So actually, the TVA that exists in the current Marvel Comics universe is a survivor of the previous universe.
Yeah, but that's not introduced in the show, though, is it? Right.
No, but the idea of the like time, what do they call them? The time warpers, or the devices that they're using to like trap people in time. I'm forgetting the name of it. It is a take. There's a group of people that tried to cross over from the previous universe into the new universe and create a new TVA, but they messed up, so they go backwards in time. They're not in the show, but they could be.
They could be, or the show could not acknowledge them at all. So let's get back to the show.
Sure.
But that's an interesting kind of digression about Secret Wars and how like the show is basically touching upon all these ripe avenues of exploration that we may get into in the future.
Yeah, I really think like if they're going towards another big event, like Secret Wars is probably where they're going. If they are delving into the multiverse and stuff, I think, the next big Avengers level event will probably be a Secret Wars.
Yeah, so like the Infinity War being like another Avengers level event is right, and like Secret Wars might be a next one. Yeah.
We have no announced date on anything like that. It's much further down the road. But yeah, and another thing I wanted to point out in this scene, the Nexus event,
By the way, Jesus, Xavier, Turbi, Alcala says Time Twisters. Is that what you're referring to earlier?
That's what it is. Time Twisters. Yeah. So we heard the word Nexus in WandaVision. Wanda herself was called a Nexus.
A Nexus being, right?
Yeah, in the comics, she's called a Nexus being. She's kind of like there to defend the multiverse from all threats using her magic. And so calling her
Nexus, Nexus was also like one of those fake ads in WandaVision too, if I recall correctly.
Correct. Right? Yeah, for the antidepressants. So, I think, now we know that Wanda is showing up in the Multiverse of Madness movie. So I imagine that they're going to tie these terms back into each other, the Nexus events and the Nexus being. And there's a whole bunch of.
And a Nexus being, by the way, is what, Dan? As far as
It's
you know?
like this, it's like the core magical being that's there to defend the multiverse.
And my understanding is Nexus beings are like the same regardless of universe, right? Like they're the same being.
Correct. Yeah. There's a whole thing about Nexuses in the comics I won't get into unless it becomes more pertinent down the road. But I did want to point out that, kind of ostensibly, since WandaVision was supposed to be the second show, we've got two shows in a row that are using the word Nexus prominently early on.
John Lee says Nexus being means that there's only one Wanda and she's the same in every universe. So,
right. Yeah.
So, okay. At that point, he goes through the line, and there's probably other things that we didn't reference that were introduced in that scene as well, but he goes through the line and he gets on trial. And I have actually a screen grab of Judge Ravana Renslayer, played by Gugu Mbatha-Raw. And there's like the timekeepers behind her, right? Represented as kind of these three godlike figures. Yes?
Correct. Yeah. The different faces, each one representing like a different part of like equity, necessity, and revenge. Those are the three parts.
From the comic books is what you're
from the comic books. Yeah. The Living Tribunal. Yeah.
So a lot of information gets conveyed in this Loki trial scene. He apparently Loki is able to figure out that the Avengers were doing time crimes, right? By, I guess, smelling two Tony Starks. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, it's a good point. Like, he makes a good point that they're the ones that are mucking around.
They're the ones that are like messing up the timeline. Like, why aren't they on trial, right?
But how does he like? One, I think he just heard the word Avengers for the first time just like a second earlier. It's just a strange like.
Well, the show needed a way to. Here's what the show's trying to do, and it's actually very clever in my opinion. Right? Is anyone with half a brain watching this show is going to be like, well, what about the Avengers? They were changing time in Endgame, right? Yeah. And so the show needs a way to address that, but in order to do that, Loki needs to know what the Avengers were doing in Endgame. And so the way it made him do that is he's like, I can smell the cologne or whatever, Axe body spray or whatever on two Tony Starks in one room anytime, right? So the idea being that like he was able to, using his smell alone, figure out that the Avengers were breaking time rules and then throw that in the judge's face. To which, of course, the judge says, hey, actually, what they were doing was just fine. Like, they were supposed to happen, you're still in trouble, basically.
My favorite line of the whole episode is when Loki says, you ridiculous bureaucrats won't determine how my story ends. And that's almost kind of like a case in point of the whole series, which is like, you Marvel executives won't let me die. I'm going to, try to fight my way out of this.
Yeah, or it's a primal elemental scream about the drudgery of modern life. However you want to read it. It's very rich text.
Yeah, for sure.
So he tries to escape by using his powers. They don't work. And so kind of interesting that they don't work in this world.
Yeah. Well, we are introduced to Owen Wilson's character backing up a bit in France. Where they're investigating a murder, which they say is the sixth one in a week, and it's been stabbed multiple times, which immediately makes you think, well, must be Loki related. And of course,
for what reason? Just to clear
that's his like primary weapon is throughout he's had daggers throughout the various Marvel things.
Yeah. And then a kid shows up, and the kid has like blue gum, right? And it's like, what's going on there? Kablooey is the name of the blue gun, right?
Yeah, I honestly don't know what is going on with Kablooey. It makes me think of like old ads from the Marvel comics or just comics in general, where they would have these like things like buy a pack of like order packs of gum and other various things you might find in like a 5 and 10 cent store. But it is like blue, like Loki's blood is blue because he's not an Asgardian. You know, he's an ice giant or a Jotun. So he actually has blue blood. So I don't know. Maybe this is like a kid version of Loki, which I can talk about later if you want. I did find it interesting that like when they asked the kid who does it, he points at the devil, and all those people on the internet that wanted to see Mephisto and everything in WandaVision, like now they're actually getting it. And there's this great quote from the director of this episode, Kate Herron, who told Entertainment Tonight that it was honestly just a super weird coincidence. Like it's genuinely a reference to Loki. The horns, he was cast out of heaven. That's what it's a reference to. So I think that they didn't quite realize what they were getting themselves into by showing a devil so early on in this show. Although at the same time, I'm like, why all these references to the devil all the time if you're not actually doing something with that character? But it sounds genuinely like they're not from this director.
So Loki's about to be sentenced to be reset when Owen Wilson, who by the way looks great, I haven't seen him in stuff in a long time, but I think he's aged very well. He is able to save Loki from being reset. Now, do we understand what being reset means, by the way? I assume it's very bad.
I assume the same too. I mean, I'm kind of curious, like, can they not put him back into the timeline
right
that he's from? Like, that's the big question I have. It's like, maybe like he got out. Maybe they reset means like they erase his memory and send him back to, I don't know if they're so worried about it. I don't know why they can't just send him off. It's not like when he was in Mongolia, he did anything that dramatically alters anything. He just kind of showed up there for 30 seconds.
I mean, earlier on in the episode, we saw one of the TVA guards like annihilate a person using his, electroprod thing, and I assume that reset is kind of like you're annihilated, because we also see like the reset kind of devices, right? That like the little things that they put around the French location, right? To like reset the location. I assume it's like some kind of annihilation, like it's bad, basically, right?
But does that timeline that he was pulled out of still exist? Like,
yeah, I don't know about that.
That I could use some clarity on.
Okay, so Owen Wilson saves Loki because he's like, I could use this guy's help. Like, standard trope of the prisoner gets to earn his freedom by helping us catch a criminal, right? So then they go into this interrogation room and they talk about, he plays a movie of Loki's life. And I have to say that sometimes I feel like, Dan, they made like the Thor 2, The Dark World, and Thor Ragnarok, and like they've spent a lot of time in other Marvel things trying to make those movies better. Like Avengers Endgame, I feel like single-handedly redeems Thor 2 as a movie. And then now we have even more insight into kind of Loki's headspace in the post-Avengers time frame.
I just think it's amazing how like central the Thor mythos has become to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Like, if you asked me which series would
which one of these is going to be the most important one, right? Yeah, I don't know that it would have been Thor. But this whole sequence I thought is like pretty awesome. He has this again, a combination of the old and the new. He has this kind of film projector, but it projects in like this kind of holographic, almost like it's like rearranging matter, the way it's being projected, and it's just like really, really cool. And you see Loki's life played out for him, and it does feel in some ways like what some people's conception of the afterlife is like. You die, and then they play you the movie of your life, and then you get to like reflect on what happened.
It reminds me a bit of like the memories from Minority Report, where that are like projected into 3D space. I don't know how familiar with that movie you are,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I thought this was really neat because they could have very easily just like had them in a movie theater and rolled clips from those movies,
Right.
which I think a lazier version of the show would have done.
And they did roll some clips, and actually it's really cool. Like there was one moment when they rolled a clip from the Avengers, and he's like, "You know who you are, Loki? You help like people self-actualize." It's like, oh, interesting. Like, you're viewing that clip in a whole new way now. But the idea, the fundamental emotional truth of this scene is that Loki sees his entire life and sees like not that much that's worth liking. Like he's not even that good at being a dick, I think is really kind of the takeaway from this, right? Is that he's not a good guy. And then in the times when he's been a bad guy, he's like been a kind of a crappy bad guy, And yeah, so
yeah, Mobius says as much. Like you're always losing all the time.
Right.
What did you think about the kind of brief aside into the realm of like DB Cooper?
So that was absolutely bizarre because I had no idea who DB Cooper was before I saw this.
That would be very confusing, I would imagine.
DB Cooper, for those who don't know, is one of the most notorious criminals in American history, right? He is a man who robbed a plane, hijacked and robbed the plane. Apparently the plane landed, he got his money, the plane took off again, and then DB Cooper skydived out of the plane and was never heard from again.
I'm surprised you hadn't heard about this living in Seattle.
I had not heard about it.
Yeah, no, I love the story of DB Cooper. I would say if anybody's interested in learning more about that story, there's a really good documentary from last year on HBO Max called The Mystery of DB Cooper. And it kind of goes into like the story with reenactments, and then has like a bunch of different like suspects who they think maybe DB Cooper was, because they have no idea who this guy or woman actually is one of the suspects was. The funny thing is they get a lot of the details here really accurate. Like even when he's getting called by Heimdall, like back up to Asgard, and all the money kind of like gets left behind. One of the big things that made the DB Cooper case so interesting was they found a bunch of destroyed bills
yeah.
down the river, like 40 miles away. So like that's pretty accurate. And Tom Hiddleston really looks like the composite sketch
right.
for DB Cooper.
The sunglasses are a little bit different, I believe, but yeah. But as somebody who was very unfamiliar with the legend of DB Cooper, this whole sequence was just completely baffling to me. I'm like, what are all these like weird details? Like he's handing the woman a note, and then he says, "By the way, there's a bomb. I'm holding a bomb." Like all this stuff that's actually from the actual case of DB Cooper. I was unaware, but then was delighted to read about it afterwards.
I'm sure most audiences have no idea who DB Cooper is, especially the younger audiences. I thought it was humorous and kind of pointless, but I thought it was more just kind of like awkwardly inserted and broke me out largely of the like emotions of the scene. And it felt like something that probably could have been left on the cutting room floor.
It was weird. It was weird because they didn't show like more instances,
Right.
Like,
I was expecting
DB Cooper, he's the guy that killed Amelia Earhart. He's the person that is Sasquatch. Like all these other mysteries from history. Like it was weird that they didn't show more of them, right?
Yeah, I'm expecting like a Rushmore club sequence where it's just like the greatest hits of all the unsolved mysteries,
right.
like just rolling with Loki walking through them. I have to think that footage exists or was planned and just never made it into the show, but I don't know.
So then there's a sequence where Mobius is informed that they've lost another unit, and then Loki escapes with a time twister, which I actually thought was pretty cool and actually very scary. Like when he subjects that woman, the TVA guard or whatever, to the time twister and like keeps like messing around with her time settings. I just thought that must be like really terrifying to be that person. You know what I mean?
I just thought it was like crazy how like easily manipulated those things were. Like he just takes his neck thing off and slaps it on. It's like all the power in the universe is just like a casual children's play thing.
You need some like bioauthentication in those kinds of things, like even like James Bond has like fingerprint recognition. But yeah, and by the way, the woman who plays that guard is Wunmi Masaku, who people might recognize from Lovecraft Country. Mobius is like, we gotta get Loki. Loki like runs around and journeys through the situation, the TVA, and accosts one of the, shall we say, secretaries, receptionists, whatever. And
all we know about him is he doesn't know what fish are.
He's trying to get the Tesseract back, and he's like, oh yeah, we have like 15 of those things in here. And then he opens this drawer that I'm going to put on the screen right now. And you can see like, oh yeah, Infinity Stones, we have tons of those, right? And that's when Loki realizes, wow, he is way beyond his depth. Like, he is in a place where Infinity Stones are garbage. Do you know what I mean? Like, these things are completely useless. So did you have any thoughts on what else was in this this drawer, by the way? So there's lots of Infinity Stones.
Well, first of all, I love the Infinity Stones joke. I think it's great, but it also, I think in terms of like Marvel, it's like, yeah, we're moving on from that. Like we're not investing a lot of energy in the status of the Infinity Stones anymore. Yeah. Like we're moving on to something bigger. Yeah. But yeah, there's like a cross in there, I believe.
There's here, I'm going to enlarge the image on the YouTube screen, but there's a poker chip for, I think, $5,000 on there.
That doesn't mean anything to me necessarily. I don't know.
Yeah. But yeah, there's like a dagger and like other interesting stuff. So, yeah. But it's funny just the idea that like Infinity Stones are worthless in this world, and that's when Loki realizes like how small he really is. He then goes back to the room and like looks at the movie of the rest of his life and scrubs through the future. He sees his mother and father's deaths, because the Loki of this movie did not yet know about the events of Thor 2 and Thor Ragnarok, right?
Correct.
Right. So he's seeing his mom die. He's seeing his dad die in Thor Ragnarok. He's seeing his entire world obliterated at the end of Thor Ragnarok, right? And probably pondering the meaninglessness of his life, right?
Yeah, I mean, Tom Hiddleston is doing some serious heavy lifting here. I mean, he's like doing. I mean,
he's staring at a green screen. And he needs to like emote the living hell out of it, basically, right?
I'm not saying that Loki is the most like he's had like the greatest arc in all of cinema, but like Tom Hiddleston is basically doing like the entire emotional arc of Loki from a half dozen movies.
Yeah.
In one scene.
It's incredible. It's incredible.
Yeah, it's great.
He's great.
He does a
He's
really
awesome.
great job.
He's awesome. Also, Timothy Mabley in the chat brings up a good point. He says, the fact that the Infinity Stones got destroyed on accident and nobody's bothered by it, kind of curious about the logistics. Are they from a specific timeline? Because I think if I understand Timothy's comment, like in Avengers Endgame, the Chosen One, Tilda Swinton, right, made a big deal about how you can't take the Infinity Stones away or else terrible things will happen. So then, if that's the case, how do you then get a drawer full of Infinity Stones? Like, where are those stones come from? Did those timelines just get destroyed? Like what happened to those?
That's a great question, and to answer it, I'd probably go cross-eyed, so I'm going to leave it there. Austin Powers style, it's best that you not think about these things.
Yeah.
And just enjoy the show.
There is a flashback. So then Loki kind of is like, okay, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help Mobius out. Might as well devote my life to something. And you right here in the show notes, Mobius recognizes that Loki actually knows himself really well, which will allow him to help Mobius out with the task. He can't offer Loki salvation, but he can give him something else, the opportunity to hunt himself. And I guess the opportunity to avoid being reset as well, right?
Yeah, so, I mean, I really like the way that he put it, where he admits that he doesn't enjoy hurting people, but that he's actually quite weak.
Mm.
And to see a character, like to believe him delivering that line after him being the exact opposite the rest of the episode, like I believed it when he said that line that he was actually feeling that way, which just really goes to sell how much work he did acting, watching his whole life play out before his eyes, because he's kind of fundamentally a different person after all of that. He's willing to admit his like weakness and faults to this guy who he was given a whole show to before. So I thought that was a really interesting way to kind of like completely invert the character but through the events of one scene, which I guess seeing your death, it's an easy thing to imagine.
Indeed. Zach Carver in the chat says, I saw some interesting points online that some were upset over this scene, the stones in the drawer. Natasha and Vision lost their lives for some of those stones just for the TVA to be sitting on a few dozen of them. I don't necessarily agree, but it's a point I completely understand, completely understandable point of view. To quote another famous franchise, forget the past, kill it if you have to, which I think, as you pointed out, Dan Gvozden, is what this show is trying to do. Okay.
But I also think the stakes are different. Like something can still wield great power for one character. Like the Spider-Man Homecoming, it's all about stopping a theft of like some gear of Tony Stark's, right? But that can mean the world to that character and mean nothing to someone else.
Yeah,
so
great point. Great point.
I think it's a matter of scale.
Okay, also Pen and Paper says his change was too quick. I think he's manipulating Mobius. Well, we will see if Pen and Paper is correct about Loki's sudden about face. There's one final scene in the episode. We flash back to 1858 Oklahoma. I like how the show does a good job of like orienting you as to like time and space. It's like, hey, we're here. This is the time and the place, and each setting looks like pretty different. And so it's subtle, but I like how like one could easily imagine being extremely confused by where we are, what we're doing in a show like this, and I think the show handles it really well. So they go and they find another scene of like devastation, and a mysterious figure lights them all on fire, and then you kind of see this person like cloaked. But
it's clearly Loki, right?
Is
I mean,
it?
They say it's Loki, but like if you can't see the face, it's not who you think it is.
So you suspect you have some information about who this Loki is, if it is Loki, right? Who we suspect it is the variant Loki, right? You suspect, you think you have some ideas of who it is and characteristics about them, but in order to go into this, you're going to have to spoil like some casting news and some other speculation. You don't know, but you're going to speculate.
I don't know.
Right. But you're going to speculate based on news you've read. So if you, as a listener, want to like avoid complete spoilers, you should skip over this. But tell us who you think the Loki is or the variant is or whatever. Like, tell us about your thoughts on this character.
And David, you might already know the answer to this, so I could be looking very foolish right now with whatever knowledge you have. But my first idea here really is that it's a female version of Loki. David, I don't know if you want to put the image up, but during some of the advertising for the series, there was an ID card for Loki that was kind of put out when he is registering in the TVA. And on the ID card, you can see where it says sex, it says fluid. And in the comics, Loki is, I would say 99% of the time presented the way you see him in the show. But Loki has also changed his sex a number of times back and forth, where I would say he, but I guess like she appears, as a woman. Typically, this is when Loki dies and is reborn. There's a kind of concept to the Norse characters in the comics that's not a part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where these characters die and are kind of reborn over and over again. I feel like that is possibly where the Thor series is headed. All of the Norse gods are essentially dead. after the events of Ragnarok. And so, we might see some of them being reborn in alternate forms. And, you can't get Tom Hiddleston forever. So why not recast the character as somebody completely different, recast it as a woman? And there was an actress, Sophia Di Martino, who they've not revealed her, cast name, but she has been announced as being in the show. And Deadline reported that their sources told them that she was playing a female Loki. And if you watch the trailer for Loki, there's like one shot in one of the early trailers where you can see Loki like sitting down on a rock next to another figure that looks like a female Loki. So I suspect that if Loki is going to be hunting himself and we don't see the hooded figure, if it is still Loki, it's not the Loki we know. It's the Loki of what I imagine. If they want to keep the character going, you cast someone else in the role and move on, let Tom Hiddleston do other things. So anyway, female Loki. David, I don't know. I want to ask you your thoughts about that, but I don't know if you have information that can confirm or deny anything that I'm saying.
I can neither confirm nor deny, but Dan Gvozden is Babe Ruth. He's pointing into the stands. He's calling his shot, and we may or may not find out whether or not Dan is right in future episodes. We'll see.
I will say, if this character or whoever the villain of the show is not Loki, I could see it being someone like Cinder or Enchantress. So Cinder is the daughter of Surtur, who is the fire demon from the opening and closing of Thor Ragnarok. And the reason I would suspect that is it's a character that uses flames to attack, is a major Thor villain, and could be fun to see on screen. But then I also think it could be maybe Enchantress, who is also a powerful magic wielding sorceress in the kind of like Asgardian worlds. And Sophia Di Martino, the actress that I was talking about before, there was a leaked photo of her in the cast in a costume with blonde hair, and she looks more like an Enchantress than she does a female Loki. So take that for what you will. But those are some of the characters that I suspect this hooded figure is, rather than just like alternate Loki.
All right. There's one other thing I wanted to bring up. Like, I think we didn't cover one component of the Miss Minutes, right, and her explanation of the universe. But the idea of we already talked about like Nexus events. Basically, a Nexus event is when a timeline splits off, right? And if a timeline becomes too divergent, then basically that is like a catastrophic outcome, right? So it's represented by a line going up towards another line, right? In these people's like meters, right? But that's a very important mechanic in the show that's throughout this episode. And I just wanted to clarify. Do you have anything more to say about that, or any more further clarifications about it? Because that's just like a dynamic that happens in like every single one of these times when they hop back. They're like, we got to make sure the thing doesn't get too divergent, right? Like, so.
Well, yeah, I think it's really smart that they're using the same visual language as Avengers Endgame, which is, again, like credit to the producers and the people who put this together, because that's really smart. But I also wanted to point out that when they describe it, they use the word like the multiverse could go into madness, which is the name of the next Doctor Strange movie. So like, I have a feeling that by the end of the show, the multiverse might not be okay. Just a feeling.
All right.
So there's that.
Damn, Dan, damn Daniel, you're calling all your shots right now. All right.
Can I call one more major shot?
Call one more shot. This is gonna be. I'm looking at the show notes. This is gonna be a big one, if you are right.
Okay, so I'm calling a major shot. It's a character named Kang the Conqueror, who we know has already been cast. It's Jonathan Majors. who's appearing as Kang the Conqueror in Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania. And Kang the Conqueror is a major Marvel villain. I mean, like Thanos level major. And like
You might almost say he's Thanos level majors.
Yes, yes.
I'm sorry, Dan. I'm sorry.
And yeah, you're killing me.
I just completely destroyed your momentum.
Yeah. Well, it's fair. It's fair. So I think it's just odd. First of all, for anybody that knows Kang the Conqueror from the comics, would probably find it odd that like, oh, he's just showing up as the villain in the third Ant-Man movie. It seems like such a strange place for that character to make his debut, considering like how like one, he's integral to the Fantastic Four, but he's become like just a major Marvel villain.
Or
so
majors.
Like, yes, majors. Yes. You get that the second time around. So Kang is his whole thing is about time travel. Like he's a major time travel. And stop using that word. He's a time travel character. That's his thing. And he's a possible descendant of Reed Richards, which is confirmed timey-wimey. But his whole thing is that he's a character that travels to the 40th century using Doctor Doom's time machine, which he has. He has a time machine. It's more like a time square. It's a whole thing. Anyway, he goes to the 40th century, which is like engaged in crazy technological war. And he basically decides, I'm going to conquer this realm, which he does. And so he has all this great technology at his disposal and weapons, and he rules over this whole, future. And he says, well, this whole future has been destroyed, so I'm going to use all of this technology to go back in time and conquer the Earth when it was still fertile and ripe for my rule. And that's kind of his thing. He just is very timey-wimey and all of that stuff.
Okay. The reason why are you talking about Kang the Conqueror, Dan Gvozden?
I'm talking about Kang the Conqueror because the character that Gugu Mbatha-Raw plays in this show, she just plays this random judge who, like, I think if you just watch the first episode, you'd think, okay, we're never going to see that character again, right? Like, well, why would we revisit this character again? And that character is named Ravonna. Her full name, I'm like, I just know her as Ravonna, but her full name is mentioned. Hold on a minute, I might have to look it up. It doesn't matter. Anyway, Ravonna is this character who's a princess in one of Kang's kingdoms in the future. And Kang like falls in love with her, and she kind of like pushes back on him a bit about this until she ultimately kind of reveals that she loves him by essentially taking a bullet for him. And he like stows her body away in stasis and is like, it's almost like a Mr. Freeze situation where he's got his like the woman he loves in a tube.
As you do. Yep.
Yeah. So like, and the character has like a whole other like series of things that she does with Kang and all that stuff. But the thing is, her character here in no way resembles her comic book character. And like, it could just be a throwaway name, but like casting someone like Gugu Mbatha-Raw in that role and naming it that suggests to me that there's something more going on here. But she's only really connected to Kang in the comics. So like, I have to think that Kang is going to be somehow involved with her,
right?
Beyond Ant-Man and the Wasp. And I brought it up earlier in the episode that like, I think there's this running idea of Loki seeing his power as something to kind of like hold over people and be showy about and be very controlling. And he asks if he can like meet or see the timekeepers, and they say like nobody's seen the timekeepers. And it makes me wonder like, well, why aren't we? If we're not seeing the timekeepers, there must be something up with the timekeepers. And I wonder if it's that they don't exist anymore, or like, could they be Kang the Conqueror, or something like that.
Right, or like maybe they're evil, right? And like it's actually the sacred timeline is bad, right? There's all kinds of possibilities about who they actually are. So
right. And in that image of Gugu and Batha Ra that I think you showed earlier, one of the heads behind her looks an awful lot like Kang the Conqueror. So it could just be, like the timekeepers or the living tribunal as it's known in the comics, but it does look a lot like Kang the Conqueror. And then there's another line that I think is not really a throwaway, where Mobius suggests to Loki that Loki isn't even remotely as dangerous of a time variant as he's used to. And like the most famous and Major's time variant.
Dan.
Yeah, I nailed it. In the comics is Kang the Conqueror. So like if you're hinting towards there being some big bad time variant, like Kang the Conqueror is your guy.
I think this is a great theory, but also I fear it's going to be like Mephisto in WandaVision, which is like everyone was expecting Mephisto was going to show up in WandaVision and didn't happen. But
the difference here is Kang is already cast. Like we already know he's coming.
Yeah.
So whether he shows up in the show or not, I do think that like elements of this show will carry over into whatever the Kang storyline they're going to do is.
All right. We're wrapping up here. People in the chat, if you have any questions, feel free to let us know. But Dan, I think we both greatly enjoyed this episode. Great start for a new series on Disney Plus. I'm psyched to watch the rest of it. Is there anything you're looking forward to? Like, what are you looking forward to most as we get to the rest of the show? And I'm going to start. I'm going to just say, like, I love timey-wimey, time travel stuff. Like, I love all that stuff. I'm so into it. And the idea of, like, a guy seeing the movie of his life, and then, like, that profoundly altering him in some way, that's just, like, really interesting idea. And I hope they capitalize on that. I hope, like it's playing with some really deep philosophical material. And I think Tom Hiddleston, and certainly Tom Hiddleston and Owen Wilson have the chemistry and the acting chops to make this land in a big emotional way. And I hope that the series does that. I think that some of the biggest problems with the other Disney Plus shows are they've brought up really interesting ideas and then gone nowhere. Like they have not landed them in a very satisfying way. The idea of grief in WandaVision, the idea of like geopolitical instability in Falcon and Winter Soldier, like these are like big ideas that are brought up well, or brought up intriguingly in those shows, and then they just went absolutely nowhere, in my opinion. WandaVision less so. Like WandaVision actually did some good stuff with it in the last couple episodes, but like Falcon and Winter Soldier certainly, I would argue, didn't really go anywhere with that stuff in a way that I thought was coherent at all. And I hope that this show takes that concept of what does it mean to know thyself, to have insight into your future, and then be able to change it. I hope it does something cool with that. So that's my hope for the show. Any thoughts?
I want to say something, echo your thoughts and say something similar, which is like about like, can you change it? One of the things about Loki in the comics is he's always on like a threshold of being a better person, or mending his relationship with Thor. And yet he can't help but be the god of mischief. And that's just who he is. And so he always kind of like gets in his own way. Mm-hmm. And that is really exciting to me because, first of all, somebody said in the chat, and you read it earlier, that like saying, oh, his change was too quick. He's clearly like lying or being manipulative. And like, me believing it doesn't mean that I don't think that he's lying. It's that like he sold me on it, which is exactly what Loki should do, which is be very mischievous and, completely sell you on going one way while going the other. And so that's what I'm really excited about, is seeing, I think Loki is a really smart character, as he proclaims to be in this episode, and I'm excited to see him kind of get one up on everybody. Like, how does he kind of manipulate the situation for his own good? I mean, that's the fun of Loki. And in this case, it's a heist to basically get his life back again, right? To be allowed to exist still, and that's really exciting to me. So I'm excited about that, and I don't know where the show is going, but I have to imagine that the God of Mischief is going to be mischievous. And I'm excited about the performances, but I'm also excited about what you were saying earlier too, is that like I hope we get a ton of different locations and places and universes that we get to visit. The trailer sold a lot of that, and I could see the show really getting wacky and putting our characters in really unusual situations. And I think that is like what comics do best, and what these Marvel movies have done best is show us new stuff. So I'm ready to get out of the TVA a little bit and explore all the different what ifs of the Marvel universe, or the different timelines that we're trying to prevent from
There's
existing.
another show for that, Dan. There's another show for that.
I know there's the what if show.
Yeah.
But I think we're gonna get into some timelines we got to destroy. At least I hope so.
All right. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, please be sure to hit like, hit subscribe, hit the bell icon. And if you are listening to this in podcast format, thank you so much for being a patron over at patreon.com/DaveChan. I want to thank all my patrons over at patreon.com/DaveChan. Y'all are awesome. Thanks for making my work possible. Thanks also to Dan Gvozden for joining me for this episode. Check out Dan's work at AmazingSpiderTalk.com. I think that's going to wrap us up for today, Dan. This has been a lot of fun. We'll be back next week. I can't guarantee we'll always have it like the next day, Wednesday night. Like, what was nice about releasing on Fridays was we could watch the show on Friday and record on Saturday mornings. Now it's a school night, and it's a little bit more challenging, but we'll do what we can. Stay tuned to this channel, this Patreon page, for future recaps of Loki, and we will see you next time.